So good afternoon, and couple of key sort of notes. One is that there are elements of this particular training that for which we will require some amount of feedback and some amount of a discussion, because today's training is about being able to explore what happens in the policy space and what happens in the legislative space and what sort of recommendations you would be making as trainers to people within the urban local body. And ultimately, you know, if I can say that the last set of slides really talk about, you know, what kind of changes would you like to sort of see urban local bodies bring about in their mechanism and functioning in order to put policy into practice through the physical sort of space and dimension for making ITCN a reality. Okay, so this particular training module is oriented towards that. You have seen these slides before, but for those who have kind of joining for the first time this particular training session, you all know that this capacity building program is for government officials. You're the ones who are actually going to be making these trainings available to government officials in your respective areas and regions. And it's a joint initiative of NIUA and BVLF, which intends to build the capacities of government actors in formulating young children and caregiver-centric policies, yeah, and programmatic interventions based on the Urban 95 philosophy. So NIUA and BVLF together have appointed CRDF as the agency, and we are training you, that is regional training institutes, in kind of making this particular program happen. And where we are in the entire map is we are at module number 3. So we've gone through module 1 and module 2, and you know, today we are at module number 3. Now, the objectives of these 3-level courses are, you know, this is what we are looking at is a orientation course, which is sort of a basic level course. And here we are going to establish the need for better understanding of infant, toddler, and caregiver-friendly neighborhoods needs for urban local body officials. Okay, the second and the third level course is about operational course and about implementation. So the second level course is about empowering the cities to further champion it, and the implementation course is to promote a somewhat more thorough understanding of ITCN, you know, in sort of then collecting data, information, and other kinds of things. Now, how will you, this training schedule, so this is a tentative schedule that we have made. So when you are actually delivering this particular part of the training, since this will be the third session, you know, your introduction, and because you have more or less the same set of people attending all of the trainings, you know, you'll have about, say, 10 minutes of introductions, okay? This time the introduction may want to focus a little bit on what is people's role in that particular urban local body in order to influence the change in policies. Okay, so that is the difference in that introduction that you will actually need to make. तो आपको basically समझना होगा कि जो लोग आपके ट्रेनिंग में आए हैं उनका क्या रोल है अर्बन लोकल बॉडी में, और वो एक कोई तरीके से इन्फ्लुएंस कर सकते हैं या नहीं कर सकते, क्योंकि आज का सब्जेक्ट मैटर उसके ऊपर डिपेंडेंट है. हम कह रहे हैं कि फॉर द असेसमेंट ऑफ पॉलिसीज एंड गाइडलाइंस जो ये इंफॉर्मेशन है उसको करीबन you might take about 60 to 75 minutes, just about an hour. जो challenges हैं, क्योंकि हम ये आखिर में ये recommendation की कुछ बातें कर रहे हैं, इसलिए ये possible है कि कुछ urban local body में से लोग आके कहें कि आप जो कह रहे हो recommendation शायद ये possible नहीं है, कुछ और possible है. तो ये जो discussion है, इसके लिए थोड़ा सा आप टाइम दीजिए, करीबन 10-15 मिनट का टाइम टुवर्ड्स द एंड आप रखिए उसके लिए, और थोड़ा फैसिलिटेटेड डिस्कशन अगर होगा तो बेटर होगा, क्योंकि आखिर में आपको इसको इम्प्लीमेंटेशन की तरफ ले जाना है. And the last thing is for 5 minutes, try and get some feedback from the audience. ये जो post training survey या pre training survey हम जो issue कर रहे हैं, जो कृष्णकांत जी जो अभी बात कर रहे थे, I think that is important because the 5 questions that we have put up for you in the pre-training survey are some of the most important subject matter elements for this particular part of the training. So please pay attention to some of these bits. And at the end of this particular training, when you answer, I hope you will be able to kind of get some of these things correct, right? Again, you will, for those who have already attended this training session, you would know. But for those who are attending for the first time, when you get this particular slide deck with you to present, you will see some of these icons. Okay, when you see this icon, it says that there are some key messages or definitions in this particular slide that you need to talk about. When you see this icon, this is a prompt to be able to consider the possibility of engaging the audience in some sort of a discussion. Okay, you can use a poll in this kind of, you can use a tool through which you can actually carry out some polling. Not in this one, but maybe in some of the other sessions, you might be asked to kind of look at a particular checklist and to point out some things that there are important elements that form a part of a checklist. Do some compare and contrast kind of things. What is given as an example versus you kind of compare it with what exists in your own city. This is a slide that you will see many times, this icon where you will be asked to summarize a particular piece of information. Here, you may want to use some local language. You might want to sort of explain some ideas in a local language, and that will help people understand the content. Here, we are expecting that you will use some local case studies. So there are some images, etc., that are provided, that you can replace with local images. So feel free to do that. So when you get the slide deck, feel free to personalize it based on the place where you are and the kind of audience that you're dealing with. Okay. So let's do a very quick recap, okay, of the last 2 sessions. Okay, the very first session that was there we talked about early childhood development and significance. We talked about the impacts of urban environment on early childhood development. We talked about best practices for creating positive impact. What are the fundamentals of ITCN? You will start to see some of these topics come up again and again as a part of the session. In fact, today there is a particular slide that, we might ask you to do some revision about what was discussed last time. So some of these concepts will be important. You'll also see things like what is social behavior change communication, the relationship between early childhood development and social behavioral change, environmental health to support ECD, and what are the objectives for our ITC neighborhood? What are the methodologies for achieving this, and what is the relevance of the Urban 95 programs? That is what we discussed on day 1. On day 2, we talked about largely guidelines, right? We talked about importance of play for young children, the live, learn, play, move sort of circuit, the idea of neighborhood, what is the size scale of neighborhoods, the current planning framework and challenges, how do you experience urban design? How do you use these guidelines? How do you how do you scale and scale elements, and how do you sort of create components to be able to make places? Okay, what is neighborhoods? What are fundamentals of street design? And how are these guidelines applicable? What are the methods of delivery of these particular guidelines? What are the various kind of documents through which some of these guidelines can actually come through? So these were the 2 things that we talked about. Today, what we are going to talk about is largely a review of the policy framework. Okay, we'll do some very quick background about policy and legislative framework for children in India. We'll talk about the missions and mechanisms for the built environment. What are the how are existing policies suitable for the application of ITC guidelines? What are some of the guidelines for the built environment? What are the gaps in these guidelines? Okay, and how do they relate to the ITCN objectives. And then the last section, and that's sort of one of the most important sections, is what could be the directions and policy for ITCN. At a policy level, how do we actually, given that we have a certain existing legislative framework, can there be an institutional framework that can be put in place that will allow for certain policy proposals to be converted into reality? Okay, so that is the scope of the discussion that we are going to be having today. Now, this first section, which is sort of a background, okay, it will provide you an overview of some key constitutional rights, existing policies, legislations, acts, and all of that. And it would also summarize the predominant focus areas of the policy landscape that exist in the country, and it will try and create a relationship between the existing policy landscape and how we want to sort of move from this policy landscape to trying to meet the needs of infant, toddler, and caregiver friendly neighborhoods sort of needs out there. Okay. So, very high level snapshot. Children are key stakeholders in the urban development. By now, we already know this. That's why we are all here, right? So 2011 census says that 164.5 million children in 2011 are in the age group of 0 to 6 years. Now, this is information that I have collected from, the statistical data sets that are available under the Government of India census handbooks. And about 25% of this number are actually in the urban area. So about say 43.2 million are actually a part of the urban areas, right? And this, between 2001 and 2011, the number of children in urban areas have increased by 10.32%. Now, maybe it is quite likely that with greater urbanization happening, if you take today's numbers, then this probably could be in the same range, 10 to 15% increase possibly is what we might see from this 43 million sort of number that we are kind of starting to see. The interesting thing is, these policies and programs, India has a fairly comprehensive legal and policy framework regime. And the policies and programs are being put together for establishing a certain well-being of children, and they have to be effectively implemented for improving their big three things, right? Education, health, and nutrition. Okay, this largely a lot of the policy programs have been focused around these elements. However, what we are going to see is that the critical focus through these particular policies has been largely the holistic development of children. So not only is health, education, and nutrition sort of important, you will start to see a shift from these individualized children-based programs into larger sort of community-based efforts to try and make a larger holistic environment possible for children. That is basically what you will start to see as a part of the program. Now, let's very quickly look at the policy and legislative framework for children in India, and let's look at some key milestones. Now Indian Constitution talks about children in different aspects. Okay, it guarantees rights to all children and encourages the state government to provide for children. Okay, so these few articles that are there as a part of the Constitution, these have been brought out to be able to highlight some key things. Number one is Article 15, no discrimination against any citizen on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them. Okay, so but the important thing in this article is to recognize that there is nothing in this article that prevents the state from making any special provisions for women and children, which means to say that Article 15 allows the states to be able to make special provisions for women and children. Although you can't discriminate on various other things, but from a women and children standpoint, you can do things to be able to better empower them. Article 21A looks at providing free and compulsory education, okay, for all children from age groups of 6 to 14 years. Okay. It was inserted as a part of the 86th Amendment in 2002. Okay, this Article 21A. Article 23 is about prohibition of human trafficking and forced labor, these laws apply to children as well. Article 39 recognizes children's rights and protections from all forms of abuse and exploitation. Article 45 is important because it endeavors to provide early childhood care and education for all children until the age of 6. Now, this is interesting because this is now starting to look at elements that are important from the subject matter that we are talking about. So when we are talking about infant, toddler and caregiver friendly neighborhoods, Article 45 उस मायने में काफी important है. And Article 47 is about raising nutrition and standard of living and improving public health as one of the primary duties of the state. और इसका relationship है with when you say that standard of living improve करना है, public health improve करना है, तभी उसके ramifications और जगहों पर भी दिखाई पड़ने लगते हैं हमें, through some of these constitutional amendments. Now, from a policy standpoint, okay, there have been several national policies that have, that have been undertaken by the government for holistic development of the children. And the 1974 one, the National Policy for Children was the first such comprehensive initiative taken by the government. And this is really a very important thing to kind of make note of, okay, because it set out the action commitments to address and honor some of the national standards and obligations related to provision of care and protection of children, comprehensive health and nutrition programs, free compulsory education, special attention to children from marginalized backgrounds, and protection of children from abuse, and the need to be able to modify existing laws so that all legal disputes between parents or institutions or whatever, in all of that, children become the focus of the issue, and their considerations are considered to be the most important considerations. So it's no longer about sort of the two warring parties, but the idea that children are important and it's their welfare that is most important. So that's why the 1974 National Policy on Children is one very important thing here. Now, since that time, you would see from this timeline that several various programs have actually taken shape. Promotion and adoption of the International Year of the Child in 1979, National Policy for Education, National Nutrition Policy 1993. India adopted the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1992. Out here, okay, with all of these changes, one other very important idea that kind of took shape was the idea of national early childhood care and education. Okay, this one here in 2014. This policy actually was ratified by the Ministry of Women and Child Development and looked at children from birth to 6 years. Now, this is really important, critical. Compasses the inseparable elements of care, health, play, early stimulation, and early learning within a protective and enabling environment. Okay. Now, very recently, what has happened is the National Education Policy 2020 has been passed, which has remarkably talked about the holistic development of the young child, and it doesn't focus just on early education, but also focuses on health, nutrition, and early stimulation. So what you're starting to see is we are going from a policy that is oriented towards fundamental protection of children towards policies which are now starting to look at not only child welfare, but also sort of growth and improvement over a period of time with a focus on health, nutrition, early stimulation and recognizing that 0 to 6 years is sort of an important time frame in the child's lives. Now, the previous slide was, I'll go back to the previous slide was about policies. Okay, these are all policies. Let's look at it from a perspective of legislation. Okay, from perspective of legislation, you know, we all know about this preconception and prenatal diagnostic techniques, you know, that sort of, you know, so that sort of one very important legislation that was kind of passed there. There have been several such legislations that have passed over a period of time: Prohibition of Child Marriage Act, Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education, you know, in 2009, Protection of Children from Sexual Offences, Juvenile Justice, Care and Protection of Children, National Labor Prohibition Regulation Amendment Act. Now, these are all sort of important acts that have tried to create a separate identity for children as a very important part of our larger sort of demographic understanding of how the country is moving towards protecting its children, right? So that's essentially what the legislative framework has done in step with some of the policy decisions that have kind of taken shape. Okay. Now, I want to ask a question. I just want to quickly open it up to you all. What from all of what you heard so far, what are the predominant focus areas of these policies and acts for children? Any thoughts from anyone?
Safety and education.
Sorry, come again, please.
Safety and education.
Yes, safety and education.
I think nutrition has been given a good, a lot of importance, because midday meals and schemes are going for the children are arranged. So, yeah.
So you're right. Safety, education, nutrition. What else? What else are you seeing as sort of what is the dominant feature that you're starting to see about these policies?
Protection of children?
Yes, there is protection of children. Yes. But again, you know, in the context of what we are talking as ITCN, what have you sort of seen in the previous sessions, and what are you starting to see with policy making in this particular session?
So development of children, overall development of children.
Yes.
Inclusive development.
Inclusive development. What does, but are the policies talking about inclusive development?
They are going to frame some policies, some type of thing, but still entire is still pending. Inclusive, we can say that.
Right.
They're moving ahead towards inclusiveness of the cities, how they are identifying different types of age sections in the societies, like children's are there, females are there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think
recognizing the children as the important stakeholders of the society, very, very important point.
yes, but Ashokji, what you're I think my question is a little more pointed. It is trying to say that if you look at, okay, I'll go back a couple of slides. Okay. If you look at all of these policies, okay, there is one overarching theme that you are starting to see with either the policies or the legislations. And that overarching theme is that the child is at the center, the child as a person is at the center of these policies. Correct? When you talk about nutrition, you're talking about nutrition of the child. You're talking about education of the child. You're talking about health and safety of the child. Everything is children-centric, which is the right thing to have happen. But but you're not seeing in any of these policies. So that is all, it's all welfare that is oriented towards a particular person, right? But none of these policies, except maybe for some reference to it in sort of the new education policy, for example, where where health and wellness is sort of being talked about, where the need for stimulation of children at an early age is being talked about. You're starting to see that until this point, a lot of focus was on the child as an individual and how that individual needs to be protected and needs to be nurtured for a better life. It is only now that you are starting to see a little bit of a shift that is saying that let's move from once all of these policies are in place, let us now start to move towards how can we create a better environment so that these policies can be put into practice. And I think that is the big shift that I want you to recognize and understand. Any thoughts, any questions about this?
So which policy is indicating that shift or change?
We are saying that, you're starting to, there aren't really any major policies as such as on today, but you're starting to see discussion and language sort of come about that talks about the need for children within 0 to 6 years requiring the right kinds of environments or healthy environments in which they can really grow and be nurtured. So, okay, so for example, national education policy talks about the need for providing, it's not just only about education. Okay, so if you compare sort of education for all, okay, national policy on education 1986 versus the national education policy 2020, if you start to compare them, you will start to see the big difference that is there in these policies, where the need for physical activity, the need for children between 0 to 6 years requiring certain quality of stimulation and better environments in which they can learn. So you will start to see the kind of shift that is happening between these things, and that's what we are talking about. So why is ITCN as a program important right now is because we are now that protection and welfare oriented policies are now well set in stone. It is time to make the shift from children's welfare or individual children's welfare toward by making sure that those remain, but also that we are moving towards a more environment oriented sort of policy framework or structure that will allow for a better environment for children. That is the whole point that we are trying to sort of talk about here. And that is where sort of urban local bodies and this whole subject matter related to ITCN comes in. Okay. So again, if you look at existing welfare policies, the list on the left hand side are the various sort of policies that are currently there. So the national policy for children recognizes that childhood is an integral part of life with a value of its own, and that children are not a homogeneous group. So until this point, what was happening was all children were taken 0 to 16 years old, were all taken up as children, right, as one single group. Now the NPC 2013 starts to create a distinction between children that are 0 to 6 and older, where they are actually starting to focus on how the 0 to 6 age group is actually special and they need better help and support, right? Again, the Ministry of Women and Child Development is responsible for executing the NPC, has also drafted the National Plan of Action for Children 2016. Okay, and they have provided a roadmap for linking the policy objectives to actionable strategies under four or five key priority areas. Okay, one is effective convergence among stakeholders. Second is child-friendly objectives towards creating action plans and saving children from challenges of abuse, providing child-friendly toilets, drinking water, hand washing facilities, all of those kinds of things. So you will start to see that, more and more emphasis on environmental aspects are starting to come into play as a part of some of the newer programs that are being developed. And what you'll see is that against all of the national level policies that are in play, On the right hand side, you are actually starting to see the table that contains some of the prevailing mechanisms where physical aspects of the ITC built environment could be integrated. Now, now it is up to us to be able to figure out, up to us as trainers or even as urban local body officials or everybody, to say that if there are certain things that are mentioned as a part of national level policies for children, how can we start to make those policies, how can we start to implement some of those policies in the physical setting, in the master plans, in the CDPs, local area plans, group housing plan, TP schemes, CMPs, whatever there are. And that is sort of the subject matter that we need to figure out a way to be able to interweave and bridge ultimately. So similar to sort of national and state level local policies, there are various guidelines at a central level, which are sort of, special missions, like you're starting to see smart city initiatives, okay, development or area-based development kind of programs. You're seeing Amrut programs, you're seeing Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, Swachh Bharat Mission. So there are guidelines and codes on one end, and there are special programs on the other side. And these are together sort of forming the framework under which a lot of urban development work is taking shape. Along with this, you also have, there is, while there are sort of various other kinds of tools that have been set up, or there are various other sort of policies that have been that have kind of come about. There is scope of improvement in sort of the policy regime related to aspects of the built environment of children and institutionalizing them to integrate into urban local bodies' day-to-day working. And in the recent past, initiatives such as Urban 95, child-friendly cities, ITCN policy documents, along with national challenges such as nurturing neighborhoods, have been instrumental in pursuing this agenda of improving the quality of the urban built environment to be more child-friendly in nature. So while there are, at one end, there are things like the Factory Act that say that you can or cannot do certain things as it relates to children. These kinds of programs that you're seeing on screen are important from the perspective of changing the urban built environment. So while at one end you might say that in the factories you can't employ children, in the urban environment there's more and more focus that is being brought in to be able to make sure what sort of urban environments are good for children to be. If they can't be at factories and they can't work in factories, then, and if the need is for them to sort of be out there and play, then are we creating the right sort of environments for them to be able to play and experience urban areas in a much better way. And this is what these kinds of programs and policies are actually trying to do. So let us look at somewhat of a policy framework review. The idea is to be able to advocate ITC friendly practices, and that's why we want to sort of look at this policy framework. The other, in this framework review, we're also going to look at things like what are our challenges with implementation of regulations. We need to understand how these implementation processes work. Like, for example, does a master plan make sense to be able to implement ITC? Does the LAP work to be able to implement ITC? Are the guidelines in the right place or not? So those are some of the things that we will look at. And the idea is to kind of look at a roadmap that focuses on the potential in the existing policy framework for sustainable smart development at local scale. Because ultimately, one thing is very clear. I mean, you guys looked at the neighborhood. You guys looked at sort of what is the size of a neighborhood, what is scale of neighborhoods. There you understood that a lot of these things can be implemented at a local scale. But given our policy framework and structure, how do master plans, zonal development plans, LAPs, TPSs, how do these lend themselves to supporting this kind of local development framework is something that we will now look at. Any questions on now?
No, sir, fine.
Okay. All right. So I mean, you all all of you are sort of urban development practitioners. I don't need to explain a lot about what is a master plan, but basically it is a long-term plan prepared under the provision of respective town planning acts or under the aegis of a development authority, with the purpose of which a city is planned, right? It's a statutory document. It helps guide and regulate development in the city for the next 10 and 20 years, depending upon the horizon of a particular master plan. And it focuses on land use planning, okay, largely. ITCN friendly guidelines are not very explicitly always mentioned in the master plans, but they are somewhat embedded in some of the visions and the policy frameworks of a typical master plan. Now, in the case of Delhi, for example, the master plan is detailed through several zonal plans and layout plans, and sort of for them, the idea of a neighborhood is about, say, a neighborhood of about 15,000 population. Elements can sort of come in, right? There are also this, oftentimes master plans will also talk about schools, hospitals. They'll talk about open spaces, for example, okay? And many times you will see standards for some of these things being put in place. Now, what is really important is what you want to sort of talk about when you talk to urban local bodies about master plans is that when it comes to an ITCN friendly guidelines, we are talking about trying to identify location of schools, Anganwadis, in sort of cluster kind of form. So the idea is that identify walkable neighborhoods, identify access to some of these places, look at a physical dispensation of these uses within the master plan, and figure out mechanisms in which playgrounds, parks, open spaces, schools, Anganwadis, things that are kind of essential for needs of 0 to 6 years can be factored in as a part of the creation of a master plan. Okay. And not only that, actually, in the present scenario, we see that most of the open areas, parks and residential neighborhoods, which are a part of the master plan, are either not maintained or have been encroached upon with little or no care, and oftentimes they turn into parking lots. Now, it's important that when master plans are made, there needs to be clear guidelines from an ITCN perspective. So the idea that while master plans are sort of big city plans, how do the smallest of areas get developed as ITCN friendly need to be made explicitly clear as a part of the guidelines that are provided within those master plans. And it is up to sort of the resident welfare associations, the local councillors and NGOs to be able to try and hold the city true to the idea of incorporating these and implementing these kinds of projects. But the master plan effectively, it's only then that the master plan can become a very effective tool for the purpose of promoting the ITCN friendly neighborhoods. Under the smart city mission guidelines, you are seeing that area-based development, ABDs, right, are sort of very interesting kind of projects. Okay, these are projects which typically help transform existing areas. They talk about retrofits and redevelopment, including redevelopment of slums into better planned places. Okay, and area-based development in the city may contain one or more neighborhoods. And these are very good opportunities to be able to convert some of these places by adopting smart initiatives for child-friendly development. Okay, so what can be done there? You can have a holistic development of existing and new area, create the idea of a vision essentially. Okay, identify citizens' expectations and relate them to the idea of quality of life. And what I have observed many times is that you can have a discussion on quality of life if you start including children as a part of that discussion. The quality of life for children, the moment you start to talk about quality of life for children, you will automatically include everybody else as a part of that whole discussion. Think about walkable localities, walkable communities, accessibility to parks, talk about last mile connectivity for caregivers especially, okay, and talk about citizen friendly and cost effective governance. So when you're talking to urban local bodies and when there's a discussion about area based developments and area based master plans, these are very effective tools of bringing about very quick change in a relatively short period as compared to the larger citywide master plans. Yeah, so these become very important tools to be able to make some of these things happen. Under Amrut, there have been projects that talk about retrofitting of parks. Okay, so besides provision of physical infrastructure, one of the upgrading green spaces, creating parks and recreational spaces, looking at ensuring every household has access to open spaces, to water, to other kinds of things. So there are lots of different things that are a part of an Amrut kind of mission. And many times under the umbrella of development of infrastructure, it is possible to be able to really improve parks, open spaces, and such areas, and they can be retrofitted with elements that relate to the idea of a ITC neighborhood, okay, and how some of these guidelines can actually be brought in. And while infrastructure developments are actually happening, some of these guidelines can easily be brought in as a part of the Amrut scheme also. So the Amrut scheme can actually become a very good sort of catalyst for improving ITC oriented development. Similarly, local area plans. Okay, local area plans. Most of you would know that local area plans and TP schemes are sort of the two sort of models. One of them looks at things from the perspective of greenfield projects. The TP scheme looks at greenfield projects. The local area plan looks at brownfield. Brownfield means existing city areas which are completely built up, which require a certain amount of change, right? Now, typically these are 50 hectare to 500 hectare, depending upon the context of the city. And usually they talk about doing it in 1 year, but oftentimes it kind of takes between 1 to 3 years to be able to get these projects done. But these are very interesting projects because they talk about trying to identify what are the fundamental characteristics of a particular place. How can you really create a great framework for enhancing public space and areas under, while you're providing for new roads, new connections, you're automatically talking about things like walkability, last mile connectivity. You're talking about access to green spaces, shaded streets, more trees. So local area plans and town planning schemes can become great mechanisms of being able to push the idea of ITC and centric sort of neighborhood. And the idea of these guidelines can actually come about through a proper sort of local area plan. So if a local area plan starts to look at ITCN guidelines and starts to incorporate, they will see that there are a lot of commonalities between what LAPs and TPSs can kind of bring along, so while you might want to do infrastructure improvements, you will start to see that LAP and TPS schemes will be able to very easily incorporate a lot of the ITCN friendly guidelines for these neighborhoods and make places better for children. Yeah, so the next slide is about town planning schemes. We basically talked about this. So the difference between TPS and LAP is the fact that TPS is in greenfield areas. When it comes to plotted development, a lot of times you will see that layout plans are a very common feature. कोई भी शहर में जाएंगे तो layouts, NA layouts तो हमको दिखते हैं. And NA layouts जब बनते हैं तभी local communities जो रहते हैं and the people who are a part of these local communities they can very easily lobby with the urban local body or the town planning department to be able to say that while the 5% and 10% spaces are being given out as amenity spaces or reserved as amenity spaces as a part of any particular master plan, can you also put in a layer of guidelines that will allow for these amenity spaces to become active spaces for children and the ITCN sort of community, actually. Okay. So for example, it's possible that certain I've seen in a lot of in a lot of layout plans, you will see Anganwadis, you will see parks, you will see some of these things being accommodated, and if one can start to focus on not just leaving that as simple open space, but really creating better value out of that, I think we'll be able to get communities which actually have a well-defined ITCN based sort of guidelines and neighborhoods being built based on those guidelines. So here's a short little sort of a quiz for you all. Now that you sort of look through some of these things, what in your view, what we have to do is we have to assign colors to this, right? So there are statutory plans, which are master plans, then the special programs and private developments. So if you looked at it from the perspective of suitability of existing policy frameworks for application of ITCN guidelines, what do you think is least suitable, moderately suitable, or most suitable? What do you think about master plans and development plans? Will that get a red color, yellow color, or a green color?
I think least suitable.
Sorry?
A red color.
A red color. Anybody else think it is anything else? Why is it a red color?
I think the scale is too vast to implement on a master plan level. Though we can give guidelines, but to make changes on a master plan level would be difficult.
Yeah, so you're right. That gets a red color. What about smart city mission guidelines?
I go with the most suitable.
Okay. Anybody else? Anyone thinks that that's like moderately suitable or least suitable? Any differing views? Anybody else who wants to think it's most suitable?
Prakash, you have raised the hand. You would like to say something?
Yeah, so basically just a one quick point, Avinash ji, in the master plan also, as you rightly mentioned, that we can see that how this all early childhood services, like the primary hospitals, the Anganwadi, what is the distribution of those things so that it is equally distributed in the city. That is going to help us in terms of accessibility, more inclusive thing. So there are some piece, but I totally see the point also that it is in a macro level. But from a provision level, that will support the ITC.
Correct.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, so the smart city mission is green. What about Amrut, retrofitting of parks?
Again, most suitable, most suitable. That's
most suitable. Okay. What about LAPs?
green, please.
Anybody other than Ashok who thinks it's Ashok is an architect and urban designer, so therefore he thinks.
So I can respond quickly.
You're right.
I have worked with Smart City Kakinada and this. So I understand the kind of projects that are being kind of proposed in ABD areas and these retrofitting parks. I think these ITCN guidelines are very much and one can implement and see the reality of it.
Right. So
Yeah.
in comparison to LAPs, what do you think about TP schemes?
TP schemes, I think I can go with yellow, moderately suitable, because there again a planning aspect of it. One may not maybe keen on ITCN framework, but yeah, I think in the process it becomes moderately suitable. Otherwise, it overlaps with the local area plan, it overlaps with retrofitting parks. So in that perspective, maybe I can go with yellow.
अंजुली जी, आपको क्या लगता है टीपी स्कीम्स क्या 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 कलर आएगा उसका?
हाँ, मॉडरेटली सुटेबल ज्यादा ठीक रहेगा, क्योंकि ये टाउन प्लानिंग जो स्कीम्स हैं इसमें वही आप बिल्कुल सही कर रहे हो, जैसे स्मार्ट सिटी का एबीडी है वो मोर सुटेबल है, रेट्रोफिटिंग ऑफ पार्ट्स वो भी मोर सुटेबल है, लोकल एरिया तक ठीक है, लेकिन टाउन प्लानिंग थोड़ा बड़ा हो जाता है, तो टाउन प्लानिंग में बहुत छोटे छोटे जो हमारे पास स्लॉट्स हैं तो वो थोड़े से उतने कवर नहीं हो पाते हैं, तो मे बी कि मॉडरेटली सुटेबल.
May I ask a question here?
Yes, please, Rekha.
When we say town planning schemes, what comes first, the area-based development or the town planning? Because that is where your policies are going to, frameworks are going to either clash or gel, you know. So what comes first?
Well, actually, in most cases, it's the master plan that comes first. Okay, that is how our policy structures are set up. And when we are talking about town planning schemes, we are talking about a very specific mode and mechanism of implementation of a master plan through a land pooling mechanism, where a certain portion of land is kind of set aside under sort of a pooling mechanism to be able to create a common larger benefit or larger good. Okay, the area-based developments and local area plans tend to be somewhat similar. There are nuances between these two things, but town planning schemes specifically, they come as a very separate sort of animal in planning, where they are largely identified as projects within sort of greenfield area, where future development is likely to sort of come in with the idea of a land pooling mode or model is the context under this particular Amrut scheme, actually.
Okay, thank you.
So Anjali ji, you and Ashok are right. They would fall under the idea of moderately suitable for all of the reasons Anjali ji aapne bataya. Okay, what about layout plans for plotted developments?
Most suitable.
Most suitable? Why do you think that's most suitable?
To a certain extent, I think it could be a saleable point for giving a good environment for the children, for private development particularly. So I think allotting spaces for children and recreation would be a favorable thing for the plotted developments.
But what is the biggest prerequisite for this to become most suitable? What is essential? What is that essential thing? So in an ideal world, I agree that it would be most suitable. But why is it really not most suitable? This chart shows that it is moderately suitable. But why do you think? How can we change it from yellow to green for layout plans?
So is that something to do with the land values and the cost of that?
Well, it has something to do with the ability to.
I think मैं कुछ बोलूं, मैं आई थिंक कि इसको पहले पॉलिसी में, वो स्टेट लेवल पॉलिसी में ला करके देन इसको आप एक्ट में जो है इनकॉर्पोरेट करा करके अगर प्लान करेंगे तो ये सबसे अच्छी जगह है जहां प्राइवेट डेवलपमेंट में आप ला सकते हैं इन चीजों को। लेकिन इसके लिए प्री रिक्विजिट यही है कि आप अपने यहाँ की जो स्टेट लेवल पॉलिसी है उसमें ITCN फ्रेमवर्क जो एक नया आया है उसको जरूर उसमें डालें, पॉलिसी उसके लिए बनाएं और उसके बाद उसको जो भी एक्ट है, जो भी डेवलपमेंट एक्ट्स है हमारे यहाँ उनमें इनकॉर्पोरेट करवाएं और फिर उसके बाद एक मैंडेटरी कर दें, खासकर प्राइवेट डेवलपमेंट के लिए, कि आप जितना एरिया आप करोगे लेआउट प्लान बनाओगे उसमें ITCN के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से आपको सारी डेवलपमेंट करने मैंडेटरी होंगे, तो ये मोर सुटेबल हो सकता है।
Right, right.
I feel-
बिल्कुल, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I too feel these layout plans for plotted development. Anyway, in the guidelines, we typically leave around 10% of the site area as one of the open spaces that needs to be leave for the authority purpose. So when we are doing that kind of 10% of the site area to be open space, we can easily ask the developer from the authority perspective that you make those spaces for ITCN friendly. And we can insist and we can get people to understand the importance of ITCN. So I think it will add value to also the project or even for the marketing purpose also. I was just going through when the discussions are going on. So even it helps in marketing the plotted development also.
You're absolutely right. But in this entire discussion, who's the most important actor?
The child?
Sorry?
The child?
No, the child is of course the actor, but in terms of the implementation, there are two actors, right? Or let's say there are three actors. There is sort of the developer, there is the urban local body, and then there is the state, right? So if you wanted to change this from moderately suitable to most suitable,
I think the urban local bodies should insist and they should take the say to that particular developer or development.
Correct.
The urban local bodies should insist and they can very well do it within these guidelines of the framework. They have a scope to say to the private developer. And in case of any, I don't know I have not read the policies, but one can talk about incentives from an urban local body to the particular developer.
Right.
To make it ITCN friendly, we can maybe the property tax or something with some incentives.
So basically, if we are able to formalize some of the ITCN related elements as a part of the building bylaws, and if you're able to create an enabling structure through which these become formalized, just as the 10% amenity space provision has become formalized, I think there's a need for some of these guidelines to be formalized and to be well understood by everybody, so that once that happens, then you can actually, then private development in the form of layout plans can actually become most suitable, because then the onus of making provisions for ITCN is not just on the urban local bodies, but it then starts to spread across to private sector providers as well. Yeah, so that's the fundamental basis around this. But thank you everyone for sort of participating and having this discussion. It was very helpful, and we would hope that while you are actually carrying out your own training, these become places where you actually start to engage with urban local bodies, so they understand the value of some of these policies and frameworks to be able to how that change needs to be driven, right? So even as trainers, you will need to sort of have this sort of an engagement with them, so look out for these icons in the presentation, because these are cues that you will have to start having some form of an engagement. Okay. All right. So we move on.
Mr. Avanish, I have just one point to say with respect to this suitability analysis. I was just thinking that, in fact, building regulations also should become a part of this table, because the layout regulations are different from building regulations.
You're right.
Large-scale residential developments which do not fall under the category of a layout, but they fall in the category of, let's say, residential apartments or so, which are huge, and they can create a huge impact on the ITCN in terms of integrating ITCN into the open spaces and public areas of development.
you're absolutely right, Mr. Karthik. If you are, if yeah, if there are people who are living in metro cities, you will start to see that large scale residential complexes which have something like 1,000 flats within a
Yes.
society. There you've got the podium areas of all of you've got parking on 4 levels, and then you've got a large podium and all of that. That 1,000 families means you've got about 4,000 people there. That's like a neighborhood, small neighborhood by itself.
Exactly.
And you're absolutely right. That building, so it is very contextual in a sense, but you will start to see, like in the next few slides, you'll start to see when we'll do a little bit of a guidelines kind of review. You will start to make an assessment of, just as you're looking at programs and policies, we will do something similar with various codes and other kinds of things. I mean, we'll talk about that in the next few slides. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on. Okay. So, yeah, I think a lot of discussion around this. So I think, Mr. Karthik, you mentioned a very good point. Just as you're looking at statutory physical plans, it's also important to look at some of the guidelines. Exactly the point that you mentioned, and thank you for the wonderful segue into this second sort of into the chapter number 3. Okay, which is essentially a review of the guidelines.
Yes.
Yeah?
Also, one more point. Since these two, they actually fall under the category of statutory approval, because if someone is going to buy a plot or buy a house, they should have the statutory approval from the authorities. Unlike the other ones, which are more like basically about guidelines and other things. These two categories fall under statutory approvals, the layout plan and the building.
No, I understand what you're saying, but I think let's not forget that when you're looking at things like Smart City Mission, Amrut, LAPs, TPS, these are all initiatives of the government. Okay, government or a government agency, right?
Yes.
And therefore, so there is, so if the government has decided that they want to actually carry out a particular change or bring about a certain particular change, then the entire mission is focused towards being able to meet all of the requirements of the change. Now, how do you define the problem is the only issue in that situation, right? Whenever you have special programs that have state and central funding, as long as we are able to establish the need for ITCN as a part of this particular special program, once that need is defined, the chances that it will actually be done are quite high. In private development, what happens is, although there is a rule and regulation, there is oftentimes a room for interpretation of a particular rule or guideline or regulation. Okay, and everybody wants to interpret it in a manner that is appropriate for their own specific condition, right? Because you can't create watertight guidelines. It's very difficult to create watertight guidelines. They are also labeled many times as quite draconian in some ways. So there's a lot of discussion right now that's going about in the urban development space, where they say that keep the guidelines loose, make sure that the intents are met, but yet let's try and do something better. So that is why helping people understand that there is a guideline, there is a roadmap is important, and then encouraging them through a certain involvement is what will ultimately help us achieve private development to move towards a more ITCN friendly sort of an environment, is what I feel.
True.
Yeah, so let's move on. URDPFI guidelines. So what we're going to do in this section is we're going to say that these are all guidelines and codes that we have all come across. And I think what we are doing here is when you're sitting down with the urban local bodies and talking about all of these things, we are essentially going to say that many times we very casually say that, please follow the URDPFI guidelines, that has everything. Now, when you start to really delve into the details, you will start to see how valuable or how important are these guidelines really. Okay, do they talk about ITCN in a very explicit kind of manner? And you will see that most of these things don't talk about ITCN as a subject area, but there are elements of ITCN within this, which if we are able to sort of bring out and kind of help people understand, then they will start to focus, they will start to use the guideline to be able to further ITCN, to further the objectives of ITCN, right? So, so URDP, everybody, I imagine everyone knows what URDPFI guidelines are. Okay, these are sort of national level guidelines that talk about how urban and regional planning needs to be done, what are the mechanisms, methods, etc., and also talks about certain standards. And within these guidelines, you have design consideration for urban roads, footpaths, cycle tracks, etc. And these lend to the idea of good quality, safe access. Okay, so they talk about how access is important, how last mile connectivity is important, you know, and one can use these guidelines to be able to leverage that aspect of those elements that are essential for ITCN. Okay. Interestingly, these guidelines are also important from the perspective that a planned city needs to have you know, small neighborhood planning units kind of thing. Okay, so neighborhood housing area for 5,000. So there are standards about saying that for what size of a neighborhood will you require convenience store, you'll require you know, schools, you'll require Anganwadi and other kinds of things. So there are these kinds of standards as well. So the URDPFI guidelines talk about several of these things as a part of their entire content, right? Next, the NBC. Okay, it talks about regulations that can be immediately picked up and adopted. There are many states that use the NBC or parts of the NBC as a part of their own building rules and regulations. They lay down minimum provisions related to health and safety of people. They talk about structural sufficiency, fire hazards, other kinds of things. They also talk about general building rules and regulations. They talk about ideas of landscape planning, asset and facility management related issues. And the code also covers provision on access for the differently abled. Yeah. And some elements of sustainable built environments actually. Okay. So from that perspective, the NBC is a very sort of cut and dry sort of a code that talks about very essential elements of human habitat. But you know, it's debatable about whether they really talk about ITCN in the best way possible or not. Okay. IRC guidelines for open roads. Okay, so this was published by the Indian Road Congress in 1989, and they were revised in 2012. Okay, you know, the IRC has moved from being a very vehicular-centric sort of a guideline to something that is also talking about pedestrian environments and pedestrian facilities. Okay, and you know, they have identified that pedestrian facilities are a critical element, and producing a pedestrian-friendly environment is essential, and good engineering needs to happen. So they focus a lot on engineering standards for all of these kinds of things, right? And their whole focus is on reduction of conflicts when it comes to design of facilities, when it comes to roads, when it comes to pedestrians. They talk about conflict reduction largely, and a lot of, I mean, this is a little bit debatable, but one could say that a lot of successful places in urban areas of the city are full of conflicts, and it is about being able to accept and make provisions for the most vulnerable where sort of ITCN can really help. If you're able to make provision for the most vulnerable group, if you design facilities such that the most vulnerable group is taken care of, then you would be successful. If you try and keep doing a lot of engineering to sort of eliminate conflicts, and elimination of conflicts extremely difficult. That may or may not be possible. But for all of that, to get a better understanding, you'll have to read through the IRC code. They will start to get a better sense about where they stand with regards to the ITCN kind of framework. Okay. So other than pedestrian facility related things, they don't quite explicitly talk about ITCN as such. UTPEC guidelines, very interesting set of document. Actually, it aims, this was developed by under the aegis of the Delhi Development Authority sometime in 2009, 2010. And the guidelines aim towards working towards augmenting and strengthening the identified city level targets of mobility and accessibility, safety and comfort, and looking at urban ecology. Okay, as sort of key things. They have a design toolkit in there. It kind of talks about how you can build roads, how you can build pedestrian facilities. Walkability is a very important factor that they have taken into account. Okay, it promotes the principle of human safety, climate comfort, universal accessibility. Reducing heat island impacts and sustainability, because they talk about trees as a part of the urban environment and other things. Okay, so it has already been adopted by the PWD, the CPWD, Municipal Corporation of Delhi, NDMC. A lot of them have adopted that. And one of the interesting things that they talk about is last mile connectivity, and the idea that street is very valuable public space, and the idea that there's a need to be able to create world-class walking facilities for people. Okay, so they talk a lot about that, and they talk about certain design elements being absolutely non-negotiable when it comes to pedestrian quality and pedestrian comfort. Okay, so those are so in that sense, UTPEC at that time when it was released was quite a big change, quite a big positive change within sort of our urban environment. And in many ways, this can sort of be considered as one of the bedrocks for as a very good sort of starting point to think about the idea of a ITCN sort of facility or neighborhood or area, whatever you might call that. ITDP actually brought about a document called Better Streets, Better Cities. They aim to deliver sort of a higher standard of living and quality of life for citizens of cities around the world. Now, they are a global non-profit organization, okay, that look at innovation, providing technical expertise, largely dealing with urban transport, but also dealing with cycling, non-motorized modes of access, focusing on people and pedestrians, and an idea of people mobility rather than vehicular mobility. So that is their sort of focus. They look at the idea, their manual that they have brought about is about better streets, better cities, and it aims to facilitate the design of beautiful, safe, and walkable and livable streets. Yeah, and they have very beautifully identified the various components of streets and how they sort of come together, and what are the essential elements around every single street, and how can street design be altered, modified, and improved based on some of the guidelines and standards that have been adopted by them. And this is a manual that is intended for planners, urban designers, landscape architects, civil engineers, government. So a lot of smart city related work that is happening around the country uses some of the ideas that are a part of this document and others, of course, to be able to design some wonderful streets as a part of the pilot projects under the Smart Cities mission. I think Mr. Karthik was talking about building bylaws and regulations. They are legal tools used to regulate coverage, height, building bulk, architectural design, construction aspects, and so on. They are applicable to all building activities. Almost every single urban development body has building bylaws of some kind, right? However, if you look at all of the building bylaw documents that are possibly there, I doubt whether there are really any building bylaws in the country today that talk specifically about infant, toddler, and caregiver friendly neighborhood as an element or as a component. So they may talk about buildings, they may talk about habitat, they may talk about various things, but they don't talk about performance standards for ITCN related stuff. And like Mr. Karthik was saying, I think that is one place where perhaps some change needs to come in, because you're starting to see very large scale developments, which oftentimes are neighborhoods by themselves, and how can you kind of make things better, whether any performance standards can actually be built into this. On elements of sustainability, you've got the IGBC guidelines. Okay. These are sort of ratings that address elements of sustainability. They talk about ideas of water conservation, waste, energy efficiency, reduced use of fossil fuels, lesser dependence on the use of virgin materials, and they also talk about health and well-being, through indoor air quality or thermal comfort or other kinds of issues. Okay. And their whole objective is to be able to create a environment-friendly building through architectural design. Okay, and these various elements here. So the IGBC does talk a little bit about the need to be able to provide amenities for children, the need for, there are certain they have a point-based system through which they talk about within a construction premises, are you providing for creches? Are you providing for taking care of women and children? Are you taking care of public transit accessibility? So there are some of these kinds of things that are there. They talk about the idea of, to a limited extent, they talk about the idea of green spaces, but from a slightly different perspective, which relates to the idea of reducing heat islands, within urban areas. So the focus of this particular guideline is a little bit different. The urban greening guidelines were developed by the Town and Country Planning Organization, TCPO, in 2014, and to facilitate the integration and preservation of green spaces and improve the quality of life in cities. Okay, so urban greening is an integrated approach to planting, care, management of vegetation in cities, towns, and townships, and in informal settlements in urban and peri-urban areas. So the idea of providing better green space, providing safe play spaces for children, contribute to children's physical, mental, and social development is something that is very important aspect of this particular greening guidelines. Yeah, and it talks about how well managed and maintained greens can create opportunities for people of all ages to interact, enhance cultural life, and provide venues for local festivals, civic celebrations, and besides meeting sort of, the various needs of the population. So these are all of the various sort of guidelines that are currently a part of the review. Now, again, something for you guys. This is a little bit of a quick pop quiz for all of you. Do you remember this chart? And can you guess, or can you name the ITCN objectives? The 5 objectives, right? Anybody? What's this?
Safety, security.
No, what is this one here?
Kids play.
Sorry?
Play.
Conducive environment for
Play,
the kids.
playful.
Play.
Yes, playful. Yes.
Playful, yeah.
This should be very simple.
Greening.
This is green.
Green.
Yes. What is this?
Secure. Security.
Safety.
Safety. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. For somebody who has not answered, I would like for you guys to try and take a crack at this.
Transport, child friendly for the prams.
Mobility.
What does
Mobility.
yeah? So what is that formal word? Child friendly for the pram, etc., etc. What do we call that? Universal dash.
Slopes. Ramps.
No.
Slopes. Ramps.
Ramp can't be an objective.
Oh, sorry.
Universal design.
That's it.
No.
Transport.
Wheel friendly. Yeah.
Accessibility.
Accessibility. Correct. Accessibility. Correct. That's right. And what is this one?
Inclusive.
Caregiving.
Yeah, somebody said that. Reshma, I think you said that.
Inclusive.
We couldn't hear
Inclusive,
it.
sir.
Inclusiveness. Yes.
Inclusiveness.
Okay. Okay. So these are the objectives, and I think what we want to do now is you looked at each of those guidelines, right? And what we want to do a red, yellow, and green. But this time I'm not going to do it like a quiz because it's too many different things there. But this is something for you to sort of try and understand that when you start looking at each of these guidelines from the perspective of the ITCN objectives. Now, does a particular guideline meet our objective or not? And the next chart that comes up essentially talks about that. Okay, so these are the objectives: safe, green, accessible, playful, inclusive. Okay, URDPFI guidelines, they talk about there's some guidelines related to ITC, okay, on safety. Very little with regards to greening from an ITC perspective. So there might be something about open space, but how does it relate to guidelines within ITC is really the question here. Okay, accessible, yes, they talk about accessibility to a certain extent. Playful, not really. Inclusive, not really. NBC, there's a lot of stuff about safety. There's a whole chapter on access for the differently abled and other things, right? So accessibility issues, there is information about that. There's information about safety, not so much about green, playful, and inclusive. IRC doesn't do a great job of ITC guidelines because, like I said, they are sort of they want to try and have discussion on removal of conflicts rather than integrating conflicts to be able to provide a more walkable, safe environment kind of thing. So from an ITC standpoint, the IRC guidelines don't really have a very great impact. The UTPEC guidelines actually do better than most of the other guidelines because they talk about safety, they talk about greening within the urban environment, they talk about accessibility, they talk about the idea of being playful, how certain streets can actually become places for people to sit, chat, enjoy, and they also talk about inclusivity to a certain extent. So UTPEC guidelines probably do the best job there. ITDP, when it comes to safe, green, and accessible, they do a moderately good job. They have some guidelines on ITC, not so much on the playful or the inclusive bits. The IGBC do a decent enough job with greens and with inclusivity, but probably not so much with some of the other elements that are very focused on accessibility or playfulness. Okay, so so this is sort of the chart that kind of says where some of these guidelines are. Any thoughts from any of you about all of this before we move into policy proposals and recommendations kind of thing?
I think all these guidelines were era. So it is not a right way to give them bad marks in respect of ITCN, because
No, it's not a question of
this phenomenon.
No, it's not a question
No,
of.
I'm not. It's on a lighter note. On a lighter note. So I think it is a good, insightful compilation of the guidelines, which can contribute to ITCN. So now I think the time has, maybe we should do something where all these guidelines can be integrated in the lens of ITCN. Maybe that could be a good exercise moving forth. So otherwise, this absolutely, I'm so happy to see all these guidelines, because we practice these guidelines every day, and and it's really useful for urban managers, because most of the times, generally they would always be tend to look into accept only building bylaws or national building code. Beyond that, they may not think about UTPEC, because they may not aware of it. And IRC certain standard, because their roads are their major work area, so they would be looking into that. But ITDP or IGBC, UTPEC are absolutely beautiful documents, and they're very user friendly also for if the urban managers, if they really look into them, they're very useful for them to implement and practice also.
Right.
I think it's a very good chapter for everyone.
Sure. Okay. So if there are no further comments, can I move to the next bit? All right. So so there are some possible policy proposals or recommendations for ITCN, basis all of these things that we have discussed. What is important is that, like Ashok, you just talked about integration. You just mentioned that, okay, all of this was pre-ITCN sort of era. So there needs to be an integration of ITC guidelines with these existing policies. So there are about 5 key things that is important to sort of carry out. And this is the message that we need to kind of take to urban local bodies, that let us try and adopt a national strategy for child-friendly neighborhood development. Okay, that's first one. Second, provide ITC-friendly spaces in all new and brownfield park development projects under the Amrut mission. So this is critical, because the moment you talk about development of a park, obviously the most important stakeholders of the park are those children from 0 to 6 years. So extremely important that ITCN elements are incorporated as a part of that. There needs to be a mandatory provision to incorporate ITC aspects in city development plans. So with any infrastructure development that is actually being carried out, ITC elements need to be a must. When any standards, guidelines are being developed, or old and new neighborhoods are being developed, ITC related elements need to be a part of any such renewal projects or redevelopment projects that kind of happen. And amendments or additions of specific ITC infrastructure to existing built environment norms like URDPFI. So whenever sort of URDPFI undergoes changes, then the amendments need to factor in, the ITC components in there. So these are sort of, elements related, because we feel that URDPFI, CDPs, Amrut, smart cities, these are all places where more and more work is going to continue to happen, and bringing in ITC related elements are absolutely critical for all of these kinds of projects. Application of ITC guidelines, build more learning environments in the neighborhood. So even as projects are being done, so this is an example of NIUA Ki Kalai Chowk in Udaipur, as a part of Urban 95 phase 1. You're starting to see some of these elements being brought in as sort of new infrastructure changes are being made. This is DP Road, Pune, smart city area-based development. Okay, so this is all implemented work. This is all there. This is all there as a part of the pilots that are actually in place. The idea of integrating play spaces in the public realm is such an important thing, right? You're starting to see Rahagiri make a comeback now. At least I don't know what other cities, but I think perhaps the first Rahagiri sessions in Mumbai, I think happened this past weekend. These are Sunday street closures of certain streets, and become a very important way to be able to reclaim public space for people in the neighborhoods, right? Child care centers, I think is really important. I mean, this is a, when you are talking to when you're talking to people within your own area, if you have decent examples of a very good child care center which has adequate play spaces and everything, please go out and take pictures and use those pictures. This is obviously a picture from somewhere outside India. But if you want to replace this with a picture that is more local, feel free to do that. The fundamental objective here is that child care centers need to have adequate play spaces, okay, for children, because without that, and these need to be very well managed, they need to be secure. But without these, you can't have daycare centers that are all indoors. That's not a great environment for children. They need to have outdoor environments and well curated environments also. Traffic calming is such an important thing. We're starting to see a lot of focus from some of the smart city work that is happening in looking at providing adequate refuge islands, in sort of right sizing the streets, making sure that it becomes easy for people to access, cross, stop, and create a safe space for crossing, etc. So I think nationwide, a traffic calming plans need to be put into practice, and there's a great example from Coimbatore, actually. And promote safe roads to pre-primary schools, parks, and play spaces. This is so important because I attended a session that talked about road safety for children in Mumbai, and it's kind of interesting that people create all sorts of barricades and everything, but the to make sure that children don't accidentally step onto footpath outside the area of footpaths. But people don't realize that providing a lot of barricading really encourages drivers to drive much faster. So somehow we need to figure out mechanisms by which we not only focus on the idea of safety for children as pedestrians, but also focus on the idea of safety for motorists and vehicle users, to be able to make sure that they are able to also recognize that there are children that are likely to cross in certain areas, and therefore they need to be extra careful. So a lot of focus on that. It is also very important to be able to look at multifunctional spaces in neighborhoods. Need to open up school playgrounds for children, because school playgrounds are notorious for being used only during school hours, or if they are not used during school hours, there have been incidences where school playgrounds have been used as wedding events, wedding event spaces also. And slowly people are beginning to say that no, these playgrounds are important for the public, they're important for the people, and there is a campaign that's sort of going on to push the idea of opening up school playgrounds during non-school hours to as a common public amenity. Yeah. So while all of these things are happening, we've got the Swachh Sarvekshan that's sort of going on. It's very important that we use opportunities like Swachh Sarvekshan to be able to gather data and manage data. You will have your next module is going to be about data and data indicators and management of data, and what sort of data can be useful for an ITC framework. Yeah. It is real, unless you gather information and unless you gather data over a period of time, you will not be able to map the change. And it is important that we start to think about mechanisms and methods of establishing certain benchmarks, comparing any sort of change against those benchmarks, and really taking that entire program year on year, improving that program so that we start to see the progress that is being made with incorporating ITC within our cities. So from a process kind of standpoint, yeah, it is important that that we establish a certain kind of a process to be able to bring about a change in the way we are working. It is important to formulate specific guidelines for an infant toddler caregiver friendly plan for neighborhoods. Yeah, you have to establish objectives, you have to establish the performance criteria, you have to establish the methodology, roles, responsibilities, all of that. Basis that you float a pilot of the guidelines, for local area plans, for town plan scheme, layout plans, establish certain set of guidelines around them. Try and implement a pilot project or a lighthouse project, after that, to be able to really do testing. This is need, it's a new thing for us to be able to try and build specifically for them. So it's important that we develop the pilots, we monitor the progress, okay, monitor the progress against a certain set of data and analyze that over a period of time, and go back and amend some of these guidelines to be able to understand how these guidelines need to change, basis certain experience. So it's not something that you build a park and you forget about it. I think it's important that you sort of keep going back and try and say what has worked, what has not worked, and document some of these improvements over a period of time. Allow some of these improvements to be discussed and to be floated or pushed up the chain into documents like the URDPFI guidelines or smart city proposals, or certain guideline documents that get prepared. Recognize that doing good work means you will need more money, and therefore it's important that you establish and allocate a specific budget which is ring-fenced purely for the purpose of being able to make these things work. Okay, so whether it is a urban local body, create a separate line item for this. Whether it is a special purpose vehicle, create an annual plan, so that there is a defined budget that is to be spent for these things. Look at the possibility of appointing a Chief Child Development Officer, CCDO, okay, or an ITCN officer. And once you've got one pilot in place, try and see whether it's possible to replicate that in other neighborhoods through certain kinds of incentives. If sometimes they say that success breeds success, right? So if you are successful in one place, then you will achieve success in other places also. So you can actually allow for that to kind of grow. So look at potential incentives for developers. Look at incentives like FAR increases, revenue, how they can use that as a sales pitch to be able to increase their revenue. How there can be sort of win-win between the developer and the city. Actually, there's a wonderful example. There is a Thane city in Mumbai is about to inaugurate a 20-acre park as a part of a 100-acre sort of neighborhood that they have built. And I have actually gone and seen that park, and it's actually brilliant. It's wonderful, and they've all been able to do it because they had a 100-acre piece of land, and they had to anyways keep 20 acres as an amenity space. So what they did was, instead of put it in one corner, they actually made that as the center of their neighborhood, and they have kind of wonderfully developed there. There are there are actually wonderful children's play spaces as a part of that particular park. And the developer is getting the benefit not only from the FSI that they are able to sort of gather from there, but also from the sales pitch that that particular park is providing. So this is on Kolshet Road if anybody is interested, so look it up. You can see parts of it on Google Earth also. Anyway, so finally it kind of comes back, it comes down to sort of understanding, you know, nothing can happen unless you've got a champion in a city. Okay, so you've always, for any change to happen, you've got to have a champion that can lead that change. And for us, that particular champion is the Chief Child Development Officer, CCDO. Okay, so one of the recommendations on the institutional framework is that whether it is an urban local body or whether it is you know, sort of legislative council, whether it's sort of whether somebody is reporting to a commissioner or whatever, whoever is the head of that particular organization, it is important that you sort of look at the appointment of a Chief Child Development Officer, almost, you know, right, who reports directly to the municipal commissioner or additional commissioner or the key administrative officer in an urban local body or within that particular line of government. Typically, that person will sit in a role that is parallel to the chief engineer or the executive engineer, or actually the chief engineer largely, or the superintending engineer. For certain urban local bodies where you don't have a chief engineer, you would have a superintending engineer who is sort of heading that particular post. But this CCDO is actually going to be very important because you know, because it's only through the appointment of such a person you know, you will be able to really bring about a change in the attitude of that particular urban local body to bring about changes in their urban sort of framework or urban sort of space there. Okay. Now the CCDO would be a full-time position. Okay. She or he will sort of be managing the coordination of everything that relates to early childhood development policies across the city. That person would report directly to the municipal commissioner or whoever is that equivalent. This person would also have an experience in team management and cross-sectoral work, because making a park is not just about getting a landscape person in. It's about engineering, it's about landscape, it's about you know, urban design, it's about, you know, horticulture. It's about lots of different things, lots of moving parts that need to come together. So the person should have the ability to be able to manage cross-sectoral work, should have very good communication skill. But this person doesn't need necessarily to have a very deep knowledge of early childhood development. So he or she needs to understand some of these ideas and concepts very well, but doesn't necessarily have to be an expert as such, right? From a responsibility standpoint, this person is the key contact person and coordinator for everything to do with early childhood development, children, and you know, that person responsible for the needs of the population of 0 to 6 year olds within the town or city. Okay, and especially in the early years, this person has to be somewhat politically savvy also, should be able to speak to the elected representatives about the needs, should be able to speak to stakeholders and people, should be able to garner support from not only the stakeholders in the city, but also stakeholders as a part of their entire office setup, because काम तो इनको बाकी सब लोगों से करा के लेना है ultimately, you know. So that is sort of the role of this particular person. So we think that it is really important from a recommendation standpoint that not only are you going to you know, have a certain workflow associated with implementation of ITCN, but you will also need to have the identification of a person who will take charge and who will become the champion for this sort of change. Okay, so that is pretty much it. There are lots of, I think there is going to be more material that is going to come your way with regards to sort of background material on this entire policy related discussion module. If you have any questions about all of this, I'm happy to take those questions now. No, so I think a lot of so a lot of this work has been done by BVLF and NIUA, and we are actually studying this and sort of delivering it. So if you representatives of BVLF and NIUA, you guys have done a brilliant job by putting all of this together as information, guys. I want to make sure that the credit goes to the right team. I'm only one of those few people who are actually delivering this, but there's a lot of background research that has been done by NIU and BVLF. Do you see any particular challenge in being able to deliver this to your own constituents, or do you think that the matter is समझने के लिए सब कुछ ठीक है, इसमें आपको ऐसा लग रहा है कि कुछ चीजें डिफिकल्ट होंगी आपको बताने में या शेयर करने में?
I like to say something, sir.
जी.
Hello. My
Yes,
voice
please.
is, yeah. Your policies are okay at the state level and national level, but still, when we talk with the corporations or urban local bodies, they only focus on their act. Basically, that municipal act is there. In UP context, maybe see there is a municipality act which governs their entire Nagarpalika Parishad and Nagar Panchayats and their municipal corporation acts. So there is a still how we will incorporate this thing that has to be done by the state level. That act mein this provisions has to be added, like your all the guidelines which you have analysis. Still at the state level, if NIUA send a letter like that this too should be incorporated in their act, then it will be very easier to municipal commissioners and executive officers of urban local bodies to enforce some major changes in their working conditions. Thank you.
Sir, actually, point well noted. Actually, if I may just say this, that municipal administration, governance, and planning are two subjects which are state subjects. Okay, both of them are state subjects, and depending upon which state you are in, I think most of the states have separated these two things out. Planning, so there is almost every state has a town planning department, and they also have a municipal administration sort of department. I can tell you, for example, Maharashtra has what is called as UD1, UD2, Urban Development 1, Urban Development 2. Urban Development 1 is looks at urban development and planning. UD2 looks at municipal administration. Increasingly, people are beginning to recognize the need for planners to become a part of the municipal administration setup as well. So while there used to be there has traditionally been a separation between planning and administration, I think we are increasingly starting to see that municipal administration is being forced to adopt planning as a very important aspect of their within sort of their management sort of capabilities. So for example, what you're seeing this flow chart here out here, I wouldn't be surprised in a few years if you start to actually see the role of a town planner also become a part of the municipal administration, because of some of the changes that you're starting to see within the focus on planning, the focus on urban development, the focus on infrastructure improvements, which are being driven through programs of this kind, smart city or Amrut or other kinds of things. So you will start to see a better blend of engineering and planning as you're moving forward, which is why you're right, absolutely right, that it is important that these get integrated, but that change will also be something that you will see in a period of time.
So thank you so much for your active participation. Thanks, yeah, dear team.